In this series of videos, I'm going to be moving into the wonderful world of portraiture. It's a very exciting subject to study, and you'll be able to pull together all of your knowledge that you've learned so far in the course. Now, when you're learning to first of all draw portraiture, you need to study the facial parts individually so that you understand how to draw the eyes, the nose, the lips. And so then you can also look at the ears and the other areas around the face and the face shape separately. Once you know and understand more about the individual features, it's so much easier to draw a full portrait. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about each individual facial feature, the eyes, the nose, the lips, and then the ear in individual videos. So let's begin with the eye to start with. Now I've got a photograph of an eye here for you. And when we look at the eye, there are different parts that we need to consider. So here we have the little black part in the middle, that little black circle that most of us know as the pupil. Then we have the iris, that's this outer area here. And then there's the white of the eye. That's the space that's left behind after the eye opens. There's another very interesting thing though about the eye that we look at. This upward curve here, it actually consists of three big major angles. And when you look at those three angles, it makes it much easier to draw them into a curve. So before you begin to draw the eye, it's good to break it down into its construction shapes. Now, when you first of all look at the eye, you can really see this large circular shape around the eye. And even when you feel it on your head, you can feel the bone that creates the cavity that the eyeball sits inside. So we can draw that as a really big, large outer ball, a big, large outer circle. And you might remember from a previous lesson that to draw a circle, all you do is draw a cross first of all, and then you can sketch the circle any size you like. So once you've drawn that big outer ball, then you can draw the tiny ball in the middle, and that's the pupil. And the next ball can be drawn in as the iris. And it's really good to draw those balls as full balls right through the center of your cross. Then once you've done that, you can look at positioning the eye over the top of that. And that will help you to really get a nice centered iris and pupil, which is very important because your pupil is in the center of the iris. Now, there are three large angles that make up the curve of the eye. And if you see angles before you draw in a curve, it's much easier to draw that curve beautifully. So look out for those angles whenever you're drawing the top lid of an eye. Now, they usually come from the outside of the eye. The first angle just arrives either before or just after the beginning of the iris. And you'll notice that angle just slightly different on various eyes. So look for that first angle and where it begins to change the curve into a little bit higher angle. So then you'll have another angle that comes across the top of the iris and pupil, and it gradually travels upwards towards, when we're traveling in the direction towards the tear duct. Then another angle will travel downwards towards the tear duct. So you get this effect. You have three angles like that. Now the tear duct is often a lot larger than we realise. So we can just add the tear duct on to the extra part there. You can see that tear duct that adds on to the white of the eye. So don't forget your tear duct. It's very, very important, and it's larger than what we realise. Then for the bottom three angles, they come back in the opposite direction. So you've got a bottom angle first of all, and often that stops just before the base of the iris. Then you travel gently upwards, and then upwards a little bit further again, like you see here. So traveling gently upwards as we skim past the bottom of the iris, and that's really important. Try not to leave a gap between the bottom of the iris and the bottom eyelid, because in general, unless a person's head's looking right down like that, there's not usually a gap between the iris and the bottom eyelid. In fact, the bottom of the eyelid just skims across it so that you in effect draw across the bottom of the circle that creates that iris. See how I've come across with an angle? And you'll find that's very true in nearly every eye. that you see. There are, of course, lots of exceptions to that rule, but in general, you'll find that the bottom of the eyelid just covers that very tiny last bottom bit of the iris. So you have an angle that travels up and then your final angle that travels up again further. So that's a wonderful way to begin drawing your eye using the construction drawing. So let's look a step further then and see all the shadows that are in the eye. I'll just grab that photograph of the eye again so I can refer back to that. Now, when we go a step further, we can then add the overall shape of the eyebrow. Now, if we just have a look at the photograph of the eyebrow again, so I've drawn in this big overall shape. And then you can also see these shadow shapes around here as well. And it's fabulous to draw those in over the top of your construction drawing. So just sketched in those big, large shadow shapes. And then you can also just sketch in the curve over the top of those angles. So what you end up with is a very gentle outline sketch of the major shadow shapes and the shape of the eye to begin with. I also love to put on the eyelashes fairly early on. Now, not every portrait has to have eyelashes because sometimes you don't really notice them. You don't have to draw your eyelashes in, but when they're really obvious, it's a good idea to. Like you can see with this photograph, you can really see those eyelashes very prominently. So once you've created that basic overall shadow shape of the eye, you can transfer that to quality paper ready for shading. Now I use the Saunders Waterford St Cuthbert's mill paper for shading portraits. It's a beautiful paper with my wonderful Derwent pencils. So what you can do there is once you've transferred that to your quality paper, you can then begin your shading. And this is the exciting part because your eye begins to come to life. And I first of all like to go over and really press quite hard with my 4B pencil and get those eyelashes in there. So once you know exactly where your eyelashes are going to be, you can just sketch them in gently with your HB to begin with, but then really firm them in with your 4B pencil. And it's a good idea to use a chisel point tip. So if you've forgotten what a chisel point tip is, you might have read your previous course notes to know what the chisel point tip is, but those of you who haven't, if you haven't read those notes yet, that was way back in another unit, you can just prepare your pencil on a slight angle, wear it down like that, and then you'll create the chisel point tip, which is a slight angle to the tip of your pencil. And with that chisel point tip, you can then lay that flat on your page and then flick to create these beautiful eyelashes. So in our first layer, we create the eyelashes, so they're nice and dark, and then you can shade over the top with your HB pencil with a beautiful smooth shading technique just laid on the side, and build up the layers of the shadows just to a level 2 tone and just darkening your level 3 areas as well. So basically all you're doing there is laying on your first layer of shading, filling in all the shadow shapes. And then you can also darken up the pupil. You can use your HB with a bit more pressure in there and even add a bit of the 4B if you want to at that stage to really reinforce that pupil area there. Now there is going to be a lovely shadow underneath the edge of the eye here, so you can gently put that in too at that stage. Now the next stage of building up the shading for your eye is using your 4B and your 2B pencil as well as your HB. Just really get a beautiful gradation under there. See how that lovely shadow there comes out gradually lighter, so you can build up that gradation. There's another gradation under here in the shadow. And try to imagine that real three-dimensional quality that the eye has. You can shade back in the corners here so that makes it a lot darker. And remember this crease here, so that's a little bit darker than everywhere else. And with your eyebrow, you can just leave that as a shaded area and then go on and add some little tiny, just a few little eyebrow hairs in there. Once again using a chisel point stroke, but this time you can use your HB so that those chisel point strokes are just that little bit finer and thinner. So just flick those and follow the direction of the eyebrow. Now eyebrows have a lot to do with tone, so you've got to look at the whole eyebrow and see where the darkest area of tone is, and then you can shade that area with the smooth shading technique to make it nice and dark and then lighter into the area over here. So continue to build up all of your tones, but consider where that form is going back into the distance to get that nice rounded effect with your eyes. And you can add some little lines into the iris here to give that texture, just little spiral lines that just gradually leaning in, traveling in towards that pupil area. And that's how you shade an eye.